Hello and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm Matthew Bruckner, an associate professor, almost tenured at Howard University School of Law. My guest tonight is Renee Nicole Allen, an assistant professor of legal writing at St. John's University School of Law. We're going to discuss Renee's new podcast, Law Profs Are People Too, a podcast about the lives of law professors. Renee, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
No, I'm delighted that you're able to join.
Fun. A podcast interview about a podcast.
A first for me, and Brian, who normally hosts the show, is so prolific, he may have done more of these, but as far as I know, a first for Ipsa Dixit as well.
Cool.
So I like to start off just by, asking people to sort of, summarize what it is we're going to talk about. People are busy, and so what's, should they listen to the rest of this podcast? So give us what's the elevator pitch for your podcast? What's it about? Why should people listen to the show?
So Law Profs 2 is a podcast about law professors. I thought it up one restless night early in the COVID pandemic and kind of fleshed it out with some colleagues to see if there would be any interest in listening to a podcast about the lives of law professors, and decided to go at it despite maybe not so much interest. If you want to know more about the podcast and why I decided to do it, I think this conversation is for you. And same thing with the podcast. If you want to know more about law faculty as people outside of what we do for our jobs, then Law Profs 2 is the podcast you want to check out.
Great. So I'm curious, I feel like these days lots of people are starting podcasts and they're about all sorts of things. Why this one, right? Why this format, these questions? What sort of motivated you to sort of start this particular podcast?
So one of the things that I think a lot about is when I attend conferences, so AALS, SEALs, I look forward to those conferences, but not really so that I can meet new people. I look forward to those conferences so that I can hang out with former colleagues from, schools that I've been at or people that I've met along the way. It's just, there aren't many opportunities to really get to know people. So that was one reason. We won't probably have many conferences this summer and maybe not this year. So I thought it an opportunity for us to engage and get to know each other in a different way. Mm-hmm. The other reason is, I've been thinking a lot about, I just finished my 9th year of teaching in a law school. And I've thought a lot about how I can be my authentic self in the classroom and, build deeper relationships with my students and being myself and figuring out what that means while also being, a respected educator has been challenging. And so I thought this might be an opportunity for all of us to think about how we can humanize ourselves in the classroom. And so in as much as students listen to the podcast, I think it gives them a little bit of insight into just their professors as humans, not as legal scholars.
No, I think that's fair. Yeah. What is the format, right? So what can people expect if they tune in? They're going to get to know more about law professors, but you have sort of, from the 3 or 4 of them that I listen to, you sort of a standard format for the interviews.
I do, and I hope to keep this going. So my plan is to interview 6 law profs each season, and I ask 4 lifestyle questions, the same 4 questions for every 6 interviews, and then I ask a one gotta go question, which is supposed to be a fun question, though I don't know if my first go at this was really fun because I asked law professors to eliminate a first-year subject. And some of them found that difficult to do. So that's the format of the podcast. What I'm hoping to get is a conversation. And so sometimes we talk about more than just the answers to the questions. All of those things don't make the episode because I try to keep them between 10 and 15 minutes. But the more conversational, the better. So if someone wants to talk a whole lot about what they love to eat and why they love to eat it, even though that's a 3-part question, I just let them talk because it makes for really good conversation.
Yeah, I've noticed that. So, of the 5 questions that you ask, that the "what is your favorite food" portion often sort of dominates the conversation, or at least the length of time. That I feel like that first question takes a lot of the time of the show. And as someone who likes to cook and likes to see your pictures on Twitter amongst others of the food you're making, like that was very interesting to me.
Yeah, I think it's me. I don't know if it's because people know me and they know I cook and I'm a foodie. But anytime someone starts talking about food or ice cream or baking, I'm all in. So the conversation, it's probably my fault that the conversation goes a lot longer on the food part because I could talk about food all day. It's going to be really hard not to ask that question in season 2 and in season 3, and wait a little while to bring that one back because it's my favorite thing to do when I'm not teaching and writing and researching. Is eat and also cook.
Maybe you could do the standard like law professor thing in a law review article, which is say the same thing, but just say it in a slightly different
That's
way.
true.
So, well, I mean, since it's only 5 questions, can you tell everybody what are the other questions that you ask people?
So the questions for season 1 were what was your favorite food, music, and movie or TV show? What you're stranded on a deserted island. What's the one thing you hope you have? What's your favorite way to relax? And if you weren't a law prof, what would you do? And then the one gotta go question was one of them had to go, and the subjects were contracts, criminal law, torts, and property. Overwhelmingly, property had to go. It was.
I feel redeemed. I saw that question on Twitter, and I felt that property was definitely the one. And then somebody mentioned like, oh, they were Civ Pro professors. Like, oh, Civ Pro wasn't even mentioned, right? Because obviously it must stay. And I was like, I hadn't even thought to question the premise. Civ Pro would have been a top contender for me too.
Yeah, I had to. I mean, that was a question of self-interest, right? So I picked for me, Civ Pros would obviously stay. And so I didn't even think about putting it there. And so that's probably why it did not appear there. But that question, so I took the questions live on Twitter, and I think I'm going to do this again at the end of each season. But there was a really great conversation. I saw a lot of non-law professors chime in, especially on the one gotta go question, which was really awesome. The discussion there and the debate there just went on for days, and I thought it was great.
Yes, I think it was an interesting contrast with the podcast, right? Because you said you'd hope to sort of have a conversation. I feel like part of the fun of the question on a platform like Twitter is the back and forth, and it's just it just seems like harder to replicate on a one-on-one. Maybe you could pose the question on Twitter first, and then you'd have sort of ammunition to probe your guests with all the comments from Twitter about their choices.
Yeah, that would be cool. I also thought about using Twitter to generate some questions, right? So what if, I have some questions in mind for the second season, but I'm kind of curious about what other people want me to ask. So I may use Twitter to get some ideas about questions going forward.
And if people want to weigh in, what is your Twitter handle?
So my Twitter handle is at Prof Allen Tweets, and the podcast is at Law Profs 2 TOO.
Great. I'll put those in the liner notes for the episode as well. So one of the things I really like podcasts, or at least I used to when I went outside the house. And I like a lot of interview podcasts, and I feel like a lot of the people that I listen to really think about how they ask questions, what questions to ask, and what makes a good question, what makes a good answer. And so I was curious, why did you think these were good questions to ask? What do you think? Do they make for good answers? Have you had any surprising answers? So forth, that sort of thing.
So first, I'm not really a podcast listener, which means I probably am the last person who should have dreamed up and started hosting a podcast. I started listening to podcasts when I moved to New York in August because I lived in places where I had very short commutes. And so there really was not enough time to listen to anything. and I had a commute again when I moved here. And so I picked up a couple, and I liked them, but they weren't interviews necessarily. So I have some interesting taste. That's a whole nother podcast interview. We won't go there. But I wanted, I just wanted them to be interesting questions. I thought about, what our students might like to know about just the regular mundane things that we do as people,
Mhm.
and maybe even some of the things that we have in common with them, that they might not suspect. And so when I was thinking about the questions, that's kind of where I started. I also I thought it might be hard for law professors to open up. And so I wanted to keep the questions, easy, non-threatening, not too invasive, into folks' personal lives. So I felt like most of these questions were questions that law faculty wouldn't mind answering, and their answers wouldn't need to be filtered for certain audiences, and we could just have a good conversation about, things that make us feel good, like music and food and reality TV and movies.
I think that I think that's right. I had a friend who used to like to come up with questions where everybody had an answer to sort of ready at hand. Just like icebreakers, and so he could ask like how many brands of diapers could you name? Because everyone's like, well, there's like um, Huggies or Loves, but then maybe people have a few other ones. But like there's another one was like what are the sort of events in the decathlon? It's like, oh well, there's a obviously some running, there's this, but so there was it generated conversation,
Right.
which I think was the goal, and was I think was always interesting. One of the podcasts I like to listen to is Here's the Thing, which is Alec Baldwin hosts it, and he's in his own right a celebrity and sort of is often interviewing other people. And one of the techniques he uses is to talk about his own stories or foibles, and that really gets other people to open up in a way that is, I think, and so the podcast is sometimes about him more than the guest, at least in the sort of some of the questions, but it also sort of tells something about him, which sounds like something that you're also interested in. So, do you have any sort of techniques for question asking that you use?
So I actually answer all of the questions in the conversations that I'm having with people, but I edit myself out of the final product. Um,
Hmm.
because ultimately, while I want this to feel like a conversation as it's happening, I want the listener to feel like this podcast episode is about the person I'm interviewing, not about me, especially since I'm going to ask the same question 6 times, right? So you don't want to hear me talk about my love for cake and ice cream over and over and over again. So I usually edit myself out, but I think it helps drive the conversation, if I also answer the questions, because that's what people do in conversation, right? Generally, that's how that goes. Though I didn't think it would be that great for my audience to listen to me say the same things over and over. So I was actually really excited when the live tweet session came up, because it was kind of my opportunity to weigh in on answers to the questions and things that I'd edited out of the episodes.
Yeah, so I mean, that's also interesting too. So, because in part, I think it goes to a question I was going to ask about sort of audience, right? So I feel like you talked a little bit about law professors knowing each other, and especially in the absence of conferencing and whatnot. And certainly, a Zoom conference is not going to have the sort of social interaction opportunities that a live in-person conference would have. But you've also mentioned students wanted to listen to this podcast about their law professor. And in that case, they may want to listen to podcast this one because you were in it, but not another one I would host because they don't care about somebody else that I'm interviewing. And so, do you have statistics on listenership and repeat listening and that sort of thing?
So I can't really tell who's listening. I think I took the least expensive path to putting this podcast out. And so I've learned since that there are definitely some systems for tracking better analytics. I don't have those. I'm using a free source right now. But before I put too much money into this hobby, I wanted to make sure it was something that people would be at least a little bit interested in. So I might explore that. A couple of my students who, are just really wonderful and awesome have told me that they listen to it, and I really appreciate them listening. But I have no idea who's listening. I'm wondering if I can keep some of the momentum going from the live Twitter conversation, that there might be more students engaged, because there certainly were a good number of students responding to that one gotta go question.
I can imagine they've got views about which class should go.
Right.
Well, great. I think that's been interesting. So I'm curious, about the guests too, right? So you've, I think, completed now season one, and curious about the guests you had on the show. Are there people that you'd like to have? Are there people you've sought out? How do you choose? That's something certainly I think about. We're talking now after my kids have gone to sleep, and so I just don't do, I don't do more than one of these in an evening. And unlike Brian, I feel like is doing 4 episodes a week sometimes. Just how do you choose who to talk with? How do you decide who's going to make for an interesting guest?
Yeah, it's been pretty random. I certainly thought initially that I would invite people to be on that first season who have pretty strong Twitter followings, because that was going to be the place where I promoted the podcast the most. But really, just anybody who responds to any tweet of mine is fair game. So anyone who says anything in response to any one of those Law Profs 2 tweets, I'm usually hitting them in their DM and saying, "Hey, do you want to come on?" And lining people up for now season 3, because I have I'm booked for season 2, which is pretty awesome. Um, yeah, so people with strong Twitter followings, but also, I talk to people this season who I don't know at all, which actually I think made for a better interview, because I didn't know them either. So I was trying to find out about something about them too, like the listener. I also I'm really conscious about not excluding anyone. So I want to talk to law school faculty, from librarians to academic support, to, casebook faculty. I want to talk to everyone. I want to talk to people who teach at law schools, but might not be on full-time faculty, but certainly, have a teaching role at their schools. I want to make sure that this is an inclusive place. And so it's really important to me to talk to people in all different specialty areas.
No, I very much agree. Right, so my area is bankruptcy, and so I've talked to people about bankruptcy and student loans and financial technology as well. And so I've talked with people about these subjects, but also if it's not sort of an area where I'm sort of deeply invested in personally, it's something I want to talk with junior faculty, fellows, people on the market, people who need to have their voices lifted up, because this, again, time is short, and it's nice to have to give space to people who haven't maybe had the opportunities before as well.
Yeah, I hope so. I teach legal writing now. I spent 8 years in academic support and bar prep. And so, I definitely want to make sure that, voices that are sometimes marginalized in law schools are going to be able to be a part of this. It's really important to me that happens. So far, so good.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I've got 2 more questions for you. What's your big takeaway from doing season 1 already and sort of having lined up season 2? Right, what have you sort of learned from or taken away from this experience?
So podcasting is hard. It's like a whole second job. Like like you said, you do this late at night, once your kids are in bed. I don't have children. And still I find I'm not quite sure how manage or juggle. It's just a lot of time. It takes a lot more time than I anticipated. So I think that's, I've learned that I have a close law school classmate who started a podcast about 6 months ago. And I listened to it. I want to support him. But what I didn't ask him, and what he didn't tell me, is that he has people who edit his podcast. So he doesn't do any of this himself. I'm listening, I'm like, his podcast sounds so good. And then the first time I sat down to edit an episode, I'm like, what is happening here? So yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's fun. But it takes a lot of time, to cut out, 2 seconds of audio from, a 1 minute clip and then keep all the clips together. I mean, it takes a lot of time. So that's been a huge learning experience. I think the other thing that I learned is that you kind of can't do a podcast without a studio. And so I am right now in my studio closet. Um, I am sitting on top of my laundry hamper. I have pushed my clothes to the side so that I can make space for myself. But the audio quality sounds much better from my studio closet. I have a couple of my uncles are professional, do professional voice work, and they kind of told me this, but of course I'm like, no, I can do it. My mic will be fine. And so those earlier episodes aren't as great because I was not in my studio closet. So I learned that. And then I think, probably the biggest takeaway for me, and this is something that I think with remote instruction became a lot more clear because I was recording myself all the time and I hate watching myself, but I needed to watch myself to make sure that my deliverable to my class was okay. I say a lot and so. And there's no way you can edit out every or slow. It's just a weird quirk that I have. I've learned to accept it. Like I'm over it. I say every other word. It's just a part of who I am. And initially it annoyed me. So like when I listened to the first couple of episodes, I was counting every time I said or so because I said it so often. But now I'm okay with it. It's just a part of who I am. And I think it's a human part of who I am, which is kind of all part of what I'm doing. So it's okay that there's some so's and and whatever those quirky phrases are that rely on when we're kind of put on the spot or maybe a little uncomfortable. I get nervous over everything. I'm nervous right now. I'm nervous when I do my own podcast and I know the questions and I know what I'm going to say. We're human, right? I think that's kind of the biggest thing that I've kind of learned to be okay with.
So I also and so all the time, and I think it's because it fills the space. I think it's to make the other person more comfortable by not having what you perceive to be an uncomfortable silence. No, there you go. Well, you have to tell me. Years ago, I did a podcast with Drew Dawson, who's at Miami at ABI, and they had somebody do professional edit it, and they cut out basically all of the and it was amazing. But this podcast is basically not edited at all, so you'll hear what you hear, and that makes it go a lot quicker.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave off and end the episode by asking you one of your own questions from the podcast because people haven't had the chance to hear you talk about this, and because from our Twitter feeds it seems like a shared interest. So you have some amazing food pictures from the sort of quarantine, and I'm curious, what is your favorite thing to make at home?
So probably it's a tie. This is like the law professor. You can't ask one to say one thing, right? I learned that this season. I kind of already knew that, but I was hoping to be wrong, and I was not. And I'm also one of those people, so it's a tie. I absolutely love a homemade from scratch cake. Really any kind of cake. I don't know that I've ever met a cake I didn't like. My birthday was last week, and so I made a hummingbird cake for the first time, and it was wonderful.
Happy birthday.
I wouldn't tell you if it wasn't wonderful because that's who I am. But it was really good. It was actually really good. So I love cake, any kind of scratch cake. I grew up watching my great grandmother and all my aunts like crowd in the kitchen on holidays and just make these spectacular cakes. And we just eat dessert for days. It was wonderful. And so I was always waiting to be in the kitchen. And by the time I got old enough to be in the kitchen, my grandmother had passed away and some of those traditions had kind of died. And so I've taken them up on my own. And every time I'm in the kitchen, I kind of think about being that little girl and just being awed by, them in the kitchen creating all of these wonderful things. So cake. And then, what was that? A year or two ago, an ex of mine bought me an ice cream maker, and it totally changed my life. And so now I rarely eat ice cream out, so like I can't just buy a pint anymore. It's just not the same. So homemade ice cream is one of my favorite things to make and eat.
A real sweet tooth, it sounds like. That's dangerous, making cakes for yourself in quarantine.
Oh man! So I threw away like less than a quarter of the cake yesterday. I gave away maybe 2 slices, but I was pretty proud of myself. I've been working out a lot.
I think we all have. Can make friends with your neighbors this way too. Drop on a cake for them.
Yeah. There's the super in my building, actually. I ran into him coming from the grocery store, and I'm like, hey, do you want cake? This is the 3rd time I've approached him this way. This is bad. I don't even know his name. Every time I see him, it's just, hey, do you want some cake? And he'll come up and get it. So he got the 2 pieces to kind of help me finish it up.
This is a good way to make new friends.
Yes.
All right, well, we'll leave off there. My guest tonight has been Renee Nicole Allen, assistant professor of legal writing at St. John's, and her podcast is Law Profs Are People Too, a podcast about the lives of law professors. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Now Jonesy was a man who had an awful appetite. His wife went to cooking school, but only learned to bake. Now when he kicks about the meals, she says, John, for goodness sake, just cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. I'm sorry that I can't cook steak, but cake is so high-toned. Why, you'll get corns and bunions from eating Spanish onions. So cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. So cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. I'm sorry that I can't cook steak, but cake is so high-toned. You know, I can't bake potatoes or even fry tomatoes. So cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. In our street, they really can't be beat. Now they've been used to company that always like to eat. Now the old man's out of work, but they always have cake. And when company calls on them, they put up a fake by saying, cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. I'm sorry that we haven't steak, but cake is so high-toned. You know, every social leader today is a cake eater. So cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. Cut yourself a piece of cake and make yourself at home. I'm sorry that we haven't steak, but steak is so high-toned. From eating too much garlic, you're sure to get the colic. So cut yourself a pieces of cake and make yourself at home.